Syrian forces today entered a part of southern city that had been retaken from rebels under a ceasefire deal brokered on Monday by government ally Russia. Known as the cradle of Syria's uprising, Daraa province and its capital of the same name returned to government control in 2018 under a previous Moscow-backed ceasefire. But rebels remained in some areas, including the southern part of the city called Daraa al-Balad. Regime forces have stepped up their shelling of that area since July and have imposed a crippling siege on its residents, sparking retaliation from fighters inside. For some analysis on the precarious situation we're now joined by Mouaz Moustafa, who's the Executive Director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force. He's in Washington. Thanks so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so it's seen as the cradle of the uprising. How significant is it that the government is got troops on the ground in this area for the first time in, what, a decade?
Well, the fact is that in 2018, after more than 7 years of Daraa being completely outside of Assad regime and Iranian and Assad regime's allies' control, about 70 or 74, 75 days ago, the Assad regime reneged on the initially 2018 Russian brokered deal that essentially stipulated that the Assad regime now has control over that general area. But the deal itself had, ensured that Iranian-backed militias and Assad regime security forces were not, inside the city, and then the shelling and this brutal siege for over 70 days continued until today. And today we have an agreement where the Assad regime is once again announcing full control of Daraa. But the fact is that this has, first of all, come at the cost of many civilian lives, hundreds of thousands in the past and thousands in this past 70 days that have been displaced. This is a population of about 50,000. And the fact is that the people of Daraa continue to stand against the brutality of this regime. The current deal, however long it may last, stipulates that there could be 9 checkpoints within Daraa al-Balad, and that the light arms of residents of Daraa would be confiscated, and that those that are are able to leave if they're afraid of being under the control of the Assad regime, which arbitrarily detains men, women, children, elderly, and tortures them. And so right now the situation hasn't changed much from 2018 in the sense that the regime is saying they have control over this area, but the fact is that the civilians of Daraa remain in danger. This brokered Russian deal can fall apart anytime, as we've seen these previous reconciliation deals fall apart, and the Russian forces in Syria continue to stand by the Assad regime, including the bombardment of civilians in the northwest, where they recently killed a family, including children.
How do you think that the resistance has managed to survive this long? I mean, it's a decade now, and one would have thought that government forces with the will, with allies such as Russia, would have put down this resistance years ago.
That's a very good question, sir. And the fact is that the Assad regime is fighting against the people of Syria. I mean, you look at what the Syrian resistance has, right, which is AK-47s and light weapons, etc. There is no army or military that's supporting Syrian opposition fighters that are trying to defend against further regime occupation of Syria and further displacement and further killing. And the fact that the Assad regime, which has the entire Russian Air Force and at different parts had 80% of its ground troops provided by Iranian-backed militias with the support of the IRGC and the regime's military army, that in over 10 years they have not been able to do so is because they are fighting against their own population. They have displaced 14 million Syrians. That is out of a population of 23 million. They've killed 1 million of them. The United Nations stopped counting at 500,000. And today, by conservative estimates, almost 200,000 men, women, children, and elderly are being held by the Assad regime in some of the worst dungeons where they're sadistically tortured to death. And as long as a regime like this continues, there's no way that the Free Syrian people will stop resisting, and that's why they've yet to be defeated. And the revolution in Syria will continue until hopefully the Syrian people are afforded their rights and the justice that they deserve.
Russia has always played a huge role in this, trying, I guess, in many ways to boost its influence, backing Syria's fifth core. What is in it for Russia? Why are they sticking themselves out to support Bashar al-Assad?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, the fact is that, people may be baffled now, like, why continue to support a dictator that's been so horrific? But the fact is the Russians have different interests in Syria. One is they have the warm water port on the Mediterranean, the only warm water port that they have. The Assad regime has given such an amount of control for the Russian military in Syria in order to help him keep his throne, that Russian military can commit any crimes in Syria, and they're not even liable to be prosecuted by Syrian laws. The bases that the Russians have in Syria now are essentially theirs forever, based on the regime's acquiescence and agreement to allow essentially a Russian occupation. And finally, the Russians are able to stand up to the international community, and namely the United States, by saying, look, we can stop the UN action on Syria. It is the Russians that stop the UN Security Council's referral to the International Criminal Court to hold the Assad regime accountable. It is Russia that stops investigations into the chemical weapons that the regime does. And I think by doing so, it gives them some memories of the time that they were the Soviet Union, or that they are able to sort of stop democratic countries. And a consensus, by the way, at the UN General Assembly about, or the UN Security Council at many times, about what should be done about Syria. So one part of it is stopping sort of, the United States, the international community. Another part is its military interests in Syria properly, and the fact that the Assad regime, is essentially a puppet that is willing to do whatever the Russians ask for. But there's another consideration, which is the role of Iran in Syria, that at times matches the interests of Russia and at times doesn't. But all of this is creating an environment that destabilizes the region, that allows for groups like ISIS and others to take advantage. And the fact that the world continues to sort of turn a blind eye to the worst humanitarian crimes of the 21st century in Syria allows Russia, Iran, ISIS, and the Assad regime to benefit.
For an outsider looking in, you've got to ask the question, why put so many trillions of dollars and troops into Afghanistan and do nothing about Syria?
Yeah, well, the fact is that, when Syria started, it happened at the heels of other Arab Springs, sort of the domino effect of that. And it also happened after the Iraq war and the war in Afghanistan that's been ongoing. So when many policymakers, and maybe sometimes the general public, when they don't understand what's happening on the ground in Syria, that it is a people that are demanding their freedom and their rights and a democracy like people in South Africa enjoy, or in Europe or in the United States, they are afraid. They look at Syria through the goggles of Afghanistan or Iraq. And so they think that there needs to be some sort of giant, military intervention or huge troop deployments. And in fact, that's not what's needed. What's needed is leadership, and to be able to help reach a negotiated settlement and a political solution. And to do that, we need to be engaged. But I think people are hardwired to think that anything happening in the Middle East is just a hopeless conflict, and any role that we can play as Western democracies or the international community is somehow going to lead to bad consequences. But the fact is, our inaction has led to the worst consequences of all, from 1 million refugees in Europe to the rise of extremist actors, to the fact that that Russia, Iran, and the Assad regime feel like they have a blank check to kill, displace, and detain civilians in Syria while the world looks away. But it would be a very low-cost, high-value investment in time, leadership, both diplomatically, economically, and otherwise, to help sort of make the situation conducive to a political solution in Syria and end the killing. Because by doing so, not only are we saving human lives, it is also in the best interests of the region and of our interests, back here, for example, in the United States or elsewhere.
All right, perhaps finally, how does this end? How does this finally get a solution?
So currently, right now in Syria, you've got the hundreds of thousands in jails. You have the situation in Daraa that is heartbreaking. And you have in Idlib, in northwest Syria, where many people from Daraa have been displaced, in Aleppo and Damascus and all over Syria, you have almost 4 million civilians, 1 million of them kids, in an ever-shrinking space, being bombarded by the Russian Air Force, Iran, and the Assad regime. The Assad regime believes that it can have a military victory, that there doesn't need to be a political solution or a negotiated settlement. And as long as the world looks on as he uses chemical weapons, internationally banned weapons, white phosphorus, the whole gamut of horrific crimes, and as long as he thinks that he can displace, detain, or kill those 4 million civilians, he believes he can declare victory and that would be the end of it. But the fact is that we need to change the calculations of Russia and that of the Assad regime and others. And here what we're calling on is the protection of those civilians, particularly in Idlib province, because by doing so, you rob the Assad regime of this military victory, and then it becomes conducive to a negotiated settlement. And to do so, the United States, with its allies and the international community as a whole, must hold criminals accountable by opening court cases, even in national courts if the ICC is close to us, against the crimes being committed. For example, the Caesar file, which people can learn more about, can show the proof of that. Number two, we should also have economic sanctions on the heads of these military branches and those that are killing civilians in Syria, because that deters them from doing so, and to also make it clear that the killing of civilians and mass atrocities will not be tolerated. And so by taking away that military solution option, it becomes realistic for hopefully a political settlement that at least ends the killing for now. And in areas liberated from the Assad regime, people can show the world what a free Syria can look like. And hopefully in time, all the people in Syria are able to have their God-given rights of liberty, freedom, democracy, and the freedom of assembly that they are robbed of in any part that is controlled by Assad, Iran, or Russia.
Well, let's pray for a solution to come very soon. So many lives lost and so much destruction over time. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Your insights greatly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Have a great day.